One of the first gaming genres to ever exist is the racing genre. It makes sense that this genre, alongside sports, would become a focal point of early video game design, considering the broad appeal of cars within the target audience of, at the time anyway, prepubescent boys. The real draw of racing is a sense of speed, however, and that's the mechanic I'll be looking at today. You're watching Rayl Deal Games, and something I've always really liked about video games is the ways in which the medium is able to break the divide between art and the player. There's an immediacy to the art form that is unmatched and is what keeps me coming back and trying new things each and every day. I make new gaming videos every single Friday, and if you end up liking this video, consider sticking around. I've got loads of stuff on the horizon, ranging from vintage, retro, and modern gaming across all genres. Speed, that thrilling rush of air brushing through your hair, wind crackling against your ears, and light bending in your periphery, is a difficult thing to represent on a 2D plane. In this way, games have always had to use mechanical design, sound, and graphics to bridge the gap between the player and the feeling racing games typically attempt to provide. Revving up the player is an important aspect of subjecting them to the sanctuary of speed, and one of the earliest examples of this that I could think of is Excitebike. The speed design of this 1984 NES classic is pretty simple, via the sound of the player's engine, the constantly ticking timer, staggering of AI racers, and environmental elements that cost speed to move through, such as sand or grass. Excitebike represents speed within the context of an 8-bit home console game. All of these elements are things that would continue to be a part of racing games moving forward, and even though I would say Excitebike is immediately outclassed by many of the games that came out shortly afterward, it represented speed in significant ways to make the player feel like they were racing. Feeling an essence of speed is all games can really do to start getting the player's heart pumping, and in this way, Excitebike is an early example of this effect. Our perspective on speed is directly related to the theory of relativity, and as such, the most important thing Excitebike and later titles like Chase HQ do is place other racers ahead of the player. The fact that they are ahead matters because it shows the player they really are going fast if they are able to catch up and outpace racers that started well ahead of them. It enhances the player's sense of speed, something a racing game needs to do in order for the player to feel like the experience provides the vibe they're wanting. In this way, this factor of design inundates the player with serotonin, especially once they are able to start lapping their opponents. Now, I don't want to be unfair to Excitebike because the title really was something else back in '84, or at least that's the sense I get from playing the game in the early 2000s on original hardware. Even in the early years of my life, I enjoyed what games like Excitebike, Cruising USA, Chase HQ, and Rad Racer were able to do under the constraints of their hardware limitations. Console games at the time were the best possible experiences kids could have without going to the arcade. But because of their limited design, arcades had an extra aspect of pathos in which to propagate their sense of speed. The kinesthetics of having a pedal beneath your feet, left hand on the wheel, and right hand ready to grab the gear shifter at a moment's notice is an aspect of arcade racer design that has been lost to time. The kinesthetic appeal of the immediacy provided by being in a seat with all the amenities of car features was an important part of the appeal racing games presented back in the 90s and still do today. The only way I've ever played 1999's Hydro Thunder is on original arcade architecture, smashing the pedal to the metal, shifting into turbo, and hitting a hairpin turn all in the fraction of a second just hits differently when it's a full body experience, and the limited ways in which video games could represent speed at the time was made up for by the kinesthetic nature of this game playing experience. It's no surprise that peripherals would become a major part of racing games during the 5th and 6th generations of gaming as a result. I remember my stepdad loved to play Gran Turismo 2 with the steering wheel PS1 peripheral. Having played Cruis'n USA on both console and arcade hardware, I can attest to how much of a difference the peripherals present in the arcade versions make to the overall speed factor of games from this era. Eventually, arcade racers would die out and gaming peripherals would become a niche in their own right. Yet, the kinesthetic appeal of peripherals and the preliminary design of speed mechanics in early racers are not the only aspects of speed game design that matter. During the SNES era, Mode 7 technology would be used in two important racing games, Super Mario Kart and F-Zero. Mode 7 allowed games to appear almost 3D while actually being 2D. This was a great push forward for racing games since it allowed the player to be able to see upcoming turns, environmental hazards, and exactly how far behind other racers they were. In older games like Excite Bike, there was no real way for the player to know visually how far behind the CPU they were, but Mode 7 allowed games like Super Mario Kart and F-Zero to display their tracks in ways that better fit into the player's relative perspective. It creates the possibility of dynamic and complex level design when tracks are displayed in this way, and presentation is the only real way console games could represent speed to the player. In this way, both the NES and SNES used creative game design elements and psychology to ascribe a vibe of speed to their players, whereas arcade games could use kinesthetic elements to add a physical aspect to their game design. The introduction of 3D made Mode 7 tech obsolete and opened the doors for new ways of displaying speed in games. Drifting. Now, drifting existed in racers before the PS1, however, drifting really became a forefront of racing game design in the 5th generation of gaming. Whenever I think of drifting in video games, CTR Crash Team Racing is the first thing that comes to mind. Drifting is such an important mechanic in Crash Team Racing as it's really the only way to win any race as the game progressively gets more difficult. Essentially, the game allows the player to boost 3 times by building up a boost meter by drifting, incentivizing the player to pay attention to their drift gauge and to the race at hand. The stimuli shoved in the player's face makes it harder to notice that CPR really doesn't move at a quick pace in the traditional sense. It's something a lot of games from this era did, as Spyro and Ape Escape both also utilize tools at their disposal to hide the fact that they rarely actually allow the player to move at a fast pace. It's kind of why I've been emphasizing the way games create a sense of speed. A sense of speed doesn't actually require fast movement. It's not like the karts in CTR move slowly, but they definitely move slower than what arcade racers could provide at the time. In this way, visual indicators are an important aspect of representing speed to the player, which is why Nitro Fueled would add an extra visual indicator on the wheels of each kart during drifts. In the original, this little bar in the bottom right corner does enough of a good job on its own. It's something that loads of indie racers would begin to do as well, with Nightmare Kart, Parking Garage Rally Circuit, and Victory Heat Rally being perfect recent examples. Nightmare Kart uses a fringe of flame, fueling the player's anticipation for the impending explosion that catapults them forward at intense speeds. Victory Heat Rally has the same type of drift meter mechanic as CTR, but that game also adds this sort of white wind visual feature to the player's screen when they hit a boost, further boosting their sense of speed. The most interesting of these is how Parking Garage Rally Circuit chooses to represent speed. The game is a throwback to the low poly racers of old, and as such it matches the aesthetic of the time, and interestingly enough, it also mimics the slow movement present in a lot of early 3D titles. Similar to CTR, Parking Garage Rally Circuit uses visual cues, level design, and its drifting focus to cover up this fact. The drifts in this game are denoted by yellow or blue arrows that appear out of the player's tire when they're hitting a drift. Instead of having the player race against actual cars, Parking Garage Rally Circuit puts them against shades of drivers, each denoting a certain level of trophy reward. In this way, the player is able to know how fast they're going relative to how fast they want to be going should they want the top prize. This is an interesting way of reworking the idea of presenting the player with opponents to pass as a way of working in the relativity of their perspective into the synthesis of a sense of speed. Victory Heat Rally does this the other way, by spacing out AI racers in the same way Excite Bike did back in '84, and each of these games are able to represent speed to varying degrees as a result. So far, I've talked about loads of early arcade and kart racers, but this leaves a glaring hole in my analysis of speed design in video games. It's important to also include how racing sims also engender a sense of speed in the player. Within this section of the racing genre, I've only ever played one game, Forza Horizon 5. I'd like to check out more from the Gran Turismo series at some point in the future, so let me know in the comments below if you'd like me to review something like that down the line. In Forza Horizon 5, cars are broken into tiers, ranging from D to S2, and this determines what sorts of cars the player has to race against. In this way, Forza Horizon 5 is sort of in between the ways in which Excite Bike and Parking Garage Rally Circuit display speed, as the player is constantly pressured by the racers immediately on their tail at all times. This rubber banding puts the player on edge, making them need to perpetually play flawlessly to ensure they don't lose at the last second. This pressure in conjunction with the scenery zipping past the player's periphery at all times times, makes them feel fast whenever they're able to sleuth their way ahead of the other racers with a well-executed drift around a corner. With some tinkering, the player can even overclock their engine to make it so that they are crazy ahead of the other racers within their same tier, which does a lot for the sense of speed the game is able to create. As a last lap, a final loop around this topic, I'd like to talk about one of my lifelong gaming passions, Magic the Gathering. I've actually not talked about it on this channel before, but I've been a big fan of Magic ever since I was in elementary school, and part of what inspired me to make this video was the release of Aether Drift earlier this year. Aether Drift is a racing-themed MTG expansion, and what I found particularly interesting about this particular set is how it displayed speed, at least on Magic Arena. The game uses sound and visual cues to create a sense of speed, even though the game itself is just a card game. Ironically enough, the drafts I did of this set yielded pretty slow-moving games, which further adds credence to my idea that the player's sense of speed is what matters the most, even when the actual speed of a game isn't particularly fast. This is done additionally through the vehicle focus of the set's design and the mechanics within. One of the key mechanics of Aether Drift is the Start Your Engines mechanic, where the player goes up on a speed track each time they successfully deal damage or otherwise harm their opponent. This is a great way of incentivizing conflict, thereby speeding up the pace and flow of the game. It's in these ways that video games evoke a sense of speed, the most crucial aspect of any racing game. Whether it be based on the theory of relativity and player perspective, visual cues, or pressure put upon the player, racing games have quickly become a genre of gaming I'm definitely more interested in, and it all comes down to the mechanical design and depth of speed in each one. And that's the video, my guys. What's your favorite way a game has represented speed via its mechanics? Let's discuss this element of game design in the comments below, and while you're there, smash that like button, subscribe, and ring the notification bell. It's the only way to ensure you don't miss out on my future work. I plan to do this sort of video again in the future, looking at a different element in video games to analyze the ways in which it's designed and how that design has changed over time. And hey, if you're watching at this point, you may as well check out one of my other videos on the screen if it suits your fancy. Regardless of what you choose to do, thank you for keeping it real with Rayl Deal Games. Have an awesome day, my friend. Yeah!